Hey, what's up, guys? Thank you so much for tuning back in to another episode of We the People. I'm currently reading a book entitled Fire on the Prairie. This book talks about the election and the political career of the first African-American mayor here in the city of Chicago, Mr. Harold Washington. One of the important and amazing themes that spirals throughout this book is the power of people coming together, organizing for a united cause. And that cause back in the 80s was to get Harold Washington elected. Here, almost 30 years later, the same thing is taking place here in the city of Chicago. Everyday people working in communities, organizing, getting out the vote, getting people excited for the elections that are coming up in November. Chakena Sims is one of those people. She's an amazing millennial who was a part of the program that I work with, Chicago Scholars, who went off to college, got her education, and brought all that knowledge and inspiration and influence back to the city of Chicago to impact her community. She's a product of CPS schools, and her passion is to ensure that individuals get elected that share her values. And she's doing just that every single day here in the city of Chicago. I'm inspired by the work that she's doing, and I hope that you are as well. Let's listen to her story and some of the future plans that she has coming up down the line. I hope that you enjoy.
Okay, so my name is Chakena Sims, better known as Keena. That's what everyone tends to call me once they get to know me a little bit more. Born and raised Chicagoan, grew up on the south side in the back of the Yards neighborhood. My family and I had a family home on the corner of 52nd and Loomis, right across the street from Libby School, and that's where I went to school for my entire childhood, from kindergarten to 8th grade. Now I live in the Ashburn community, and we lived there for the past 7 or 8 years now. I currently work on a political campaign, and I do this work because I believe in electing officials who really see a vision for Chicago, for the state, that isn't the bare minimum, isn't the status quo. And I believe in, investing my energy, my resources, and my time to make sure that more people are in office that represent my values. Well, this is a big city girl from the south side that went to Connecticut College, which is in small town, New London, Connecticut. And people always laugh, like, how do you go from Chicago to Connecticut? But as a posse scholar, so I was chosen out of a group of students. It's a national organization, and, they pair us with different partner affiliates throughout the country, and Connecticut College chose me. Went there on a full tuition leadership scholarship, graduated in 3.5 years, and that's what took me there. I remember coming into college being super shy, still got along with everyone, and I was a social butterfly in a sense, but I still had this I was very shy and very soft-spoken and didn't really say too much unless people asked. I remember once junior and senior year came around, and I really started to get into politics and community organizing, and really saw how the curriculum started to affect my everyday life, and how I can pull like different nuggets from that and to really influence the work I was doing. That was the point I started becoming outspoken. I think that all of my life experiences in general kind of have shaped me to want to give back and want to serve in some capacity. I think growing up, my career trajectory has changed so much. Like, I wanted to be a professor at one time. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a political cartoonist for the Sun-Times. I guess all of these different things, but whatever the work that I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to make a difference and I wanted to reach people. I think it wasn't until 2013, well, actually in high school, when I started to really fall in love with history and I started learning about Chicago politics, that I started to envision myself being one of those leaders impacting politics. But it wasn't until 2013 when I got my first community organizing position with Chicago Votes, where I was actually like boots on the ground, going to different neighborhoods that I hadn't stepped foot in until that time, that I really started to meet people where they are, and they start to share, like, these are the things that that's wrong with the city. This is the type of change I want to see. I've lived here all my life and I haven't seen X, Y, and Z, so that angered me. And I think Chicago votes really equipped me with the tools needed to, really enact change in a very one-dimensional way through voter registration, but community organizing in general. It just really opened up a lot of doors. I think being a black woman is my being. Like that's how I navigate throughout the world. When people see me, they see a black woman, and I embrace that completely. Being a black woman has shaped the way my worldview has shaped the way that I navigate spaces, and shaped the way that I take up spaces in rooms. And I know that any work that I do, it's important that I put this identity at the forefront of what I'm doing. If I gain access to capital, access to resources, access to spaces, how is this job going to not only elevate myself but also bring black women with me, and as well as brown women? And we can get into all of the other categories of, black women, queer women, trans women, all of these. We can go across the spectrum, but if the job isn't going to elevate us in any type of way, I don't want it. I believe in the power of government, but I also believe in the power of people, in really taking ownership of their communities and taking their communities into their own hand. So on one hand, I see low-income communities thriving again. I remember my grandmother, when she bought this home in the back of the yards in the 1970s, it was a predominantly white neighborhood, and it was fully invested. It had resources. It was thriving, and my uncles would go to the park, and they would get just to go play, and they would get chased home by white residents because it was racially tense at the time, and people weren't very fond of black people integrating the neighborhood in the 70s. And she would just tell me about how every 10 years she would just see how there's a major shift in demographics, and that coupled with that was a lack of investment. So once the early 2000s came, when I was, old enough to go outside and actually hang out with kids in the neighborhood, I started to see it for myself that we had all of the key ingredients to be an ideal neighborhood for families to thrive and to families to feel comfortable, but it was plagued with violence, because when you have lack of economic opportunity, that leads to other things like violence. So how do we have a public school that is underfunded, but we have a bunch of teachers and principals and counselors that really invest in us and pour into us and want us to succeed? You have a beautiful park across the street where black people are celebrating each other and having barbecues and really celebrating and having just time for themselves, just to relax and enjoy the weather. You have public transportation that's on each end of the boulevard. You have 55th Street bus, you have the 51st Street bus, you have the Racine bus, but yet violence is still taking over the neighborhood. People aren't investing in the neighborhood, and it's just ironic that when it becomes a predominantly black neighborhood, the investment isn't there. I think it's so important for people to own their voice and stand in their truth, because no one else can do that for you. And your life experience is better than anyone, and people can't tell your story for you. And secondly, I think that our life experiences have prepared us for any challenge, any hurdle that stands before us. And I mean that wholeheartedly. And I think far too often, we have a history that people have tried to write for us. We have identities that people are trying to kind of box us in and make us fit within this very rigid parameters of what it means to be X person that you are. And I think it's important to really push that out the way and just say this is who I am as a person, and I'm using my voice to tell you, and you're going to listen to me. And it's difficult because, like I said, it's progressive, and as progressive as things seem to be moving, we still have spaces where black voices aren't valued, where brown voices aren't valued, and women in particular. Don't let a woman speak in a room. Everyone's just going to be oh, she's talking again. So it's just really important to know that you're going to take some punches along the way, but as long as you're comfortable with what you bring to the table, someone is going to listen to you somewhere down the line. it was the second women's march, and it's just one of those opportunities where someone thought of me. So I'm doing the work on the ground and like just have my head down, just trying to work, and someone thought of me and they said, hey, like, I think you would be a great speaker. And I spoke on behalf of Chicago Votes. So as I said earlier, like, Chicago Votes was my first community organizing experience, and I've been involved with the organization since its inception. And now I'm a board vice president, and we're just doing some great work in the Cook County Jail right now, getting those that are incarcerated registered to vote. We're also doing like Parade to the Polls, working with Chicago public school students to get them out to vote as first-time voters in the Illinois primary. And it's like all of these different things. Like, Chicago Votes just impresses me every single year because they're moving that needle a little further. They're challenging themselves and say, hey, like, we did this last year, but how can we be better? Well, first off, I think it's important. Like, it starts with the individual. So society is going to have its narrative that people have been running with for who knows how long. And the media is going to run with things that are going to make headlines. But I think on an individual level, when I talk about my experience growing up in the back of the yards, like, I'm not focusing just on the fact that it's plagued with violence. I'm talking about the parks, I'm talking about the transportation, I'm talking about the schools, I'm talking about the people. So we can acknowledge, the flaws of our neighborhood, but what are the good things about our neighborhood that don't often get recognition? When I worked for CPS as deputy press secretary, that was like one of my main jobs, was to figure out what are some stories that are taking place at each of 383 schools, I believe, are in CPS, and how can we elevate those stories? How can we pitch stories of students who are competing in chess tournaments, or are in culinary arts, or just did a community cleanup? Like, those are things I care about. And I was happy to be given a platform to do so, working for CPS, and because those are the stories that often go untold, and they don't always make the headlines. And I'm starting to see more often that people on my network start to share these stories a little bit more often, and we're celebrating the Black Panther stories on a daily basis at a very, starting with 5 and 6 year olds, we're sharing these things. And so I think with My Chicago is just reclaiming that narrative. It's more than crime, it's more than vacant lots, it's more than foreclosures, it's more than a racially segregated city. We just need to be more proactive of what things we share on our social medias, we share in daily conversations, and using your platform like I did at CPS to really bring light to the things that are happening in our neighborhoods. Ooh, I was this very linear thinker, and I said, I'm gonna graduate from school, I'm gonna do this, this, and that, and I was gonna check these boxes along the way, but I learned very quickly that things just do not work as planned, and I would have never guessed I'll be working on a gubernatorial campaign right now. I would have never guessed that I would have worked on a state's attorney's race. Would have never guessed I would even work at Chicago Public Schools. So it was all of these things were not a part of the plan. So I've right now just really stepping back and just doing the work and just letting things happen organically. I do have a very narrow idea of what I want to do. I do want to run for elected office in Chicago. Maybe sooner rather than later, who knows? It just really depends on a lot of different things. But I do want to be a public servant in the city. I think that's the best way that I can give back my gifts to the city. I keep talking about how disenchanted I am with the city council and with the state level politics, and I'm tired of sitting on the sidelines, quite frankly. And I think there are two roles. It's a good role of one, you can be on the sidelines and doing actual tangible things in the community to push forward this mission, or you can work it from the inside. But I think that needs to go hand in hand, and I'd want to do it from the inside, but I want to make sure I'm coalition building with the people around me to make that burden a little less heavy. But yeah, you might see me out here doing a little something. Who knows? But time will tell.